In the autumn of 1998, in a quiet community in Pennsylvania, a young woman went missing without warning, and investigators had no answers. But more than 2 decades later, a hidden clue came to light, and it uncovered a truth no one was prepared for. Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in the late 90s, was the kind of place where people felt safe. It was a city surrounded by sprawling farmlands, quiet suburbs, and close-knit neighborhoods. The downtown area was historic and charming, filled with brick buildings and small businesses where everyone seemed to know each other by their first names. It was the sort of environment where families put down roots and stayed for generations. For 24-year-old Sarah Miller, Lancaster was the only home she had ever known, and she had no intentions of ever leaving. Sarah was someone who naturally drew people in. She had a warm, infectious smile and a deep capacity for empathy that made her a perfect fit for her chosen profession. She was a registered nurse at Lancaster General Hospital, working in the pediatric ward. Being a nurse was not just a job for Sarah. It was her calling. Ever since she was a little girl, she had been the caretaker of her family. When her younger sister, Emily, would scrape her knee, it was always Sarah who applied the bandages. When their mother fell ill with the flu, it was Sarah who brought her warm soup and tea. She was a natural healer, someone who found genuine joy in comforting others during their most vulnerable moments. At the hospital, Sarah was beloved by both her patients and her colleagues. The pediatric ward could be a heartbreaking place, filled with sick children and terrified parents, but Sarah had a unique ability to bring light into those dark rooms. She would stay past her shift to read bedtime stories to kids who couldn't sleep. She would hold the hands of nervous mothers and promise them that their children were in good hands. She was known for being meticulous, dedicated, and deeply caring. Her coworkers often joked that she was the glue holding the night shift together. Outside of the hospital, Sarah's life was entering a beautiful new chapter. She was engaged to her high school sweetheart, Mark, a local construction manager. Mark and Sarah were the couple everyone admired. They had been together for 6 years, weathering the storms of early adulthood and coming out stronger on the other side. Mark was a steady, grounding presence for Sarah, balancing out her emotional intensity with his calm, practical nature. They had recently signed a lease on a small, cozy apartment just 10 minutes from the hospital, and they were busy planning a spring wedding. The wedding was all Sarah could talk about. Her younger sister, Emily, who was in her first year of college at the time, was her maid of honor. The two sisters spent every free weekend poring over bridal magazines, picking out floral arrangements and debating color schemes. Sarah was bubbling with excitement about the future. She wanted a big family, a house with a wraparound porch, and a long career helping children. She was a young woman standing on the threshold of everything she had ever wanted, with a bright, beautiful life stretching out ahead of her. There was absolutely no reason for her to want to leave it behind. Thursday, October 22, 1998, started like any other day. Sarah woke up in the late afternoon, having adjusted her sleep schedule for the grueling night shifts she worked at the hospital. Her shift ran from 11 at night to 7 in the morning. It was a tough schedule that took a toll on the body, but Sarah preferred it. The hospital was quieter at night. There were fewer administrators, fewer visitors, and it gave her more one-on-one time with the patients who needed her most. Mark made her dinner before she left for work. They sat at their small kitchen table, eating spaghetti and talking about the upcoming weekend. Sarah had a dress fitting scheduled for 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon, and she was practically bouncing in her seat with excitement. Emily was going to drive into town to meet her at the bridal boutique. Mark kissed her goodbye at the door, telling her to be safe and that he would see her in the morning. He watched her walk to her car, a reliable silver sedan, and waved before driving off into the crisp autumn evening. It was a completely normal, unremarkable goodbye. It was the kind of goodbye you give when you are absolutely certain you will see someone a few hours later. Sarah arrived at Lancaster General Hospital at 10:45, giving herself plenty of time to grab a coffee from the cafeteria before heading up to the 4th floor. The pediatric ward was busy that night. Flu season was starting to hit the community hard, and several beds were occupied by young children dealing with severe respiratory issues. Sarah hit the ground running. She took the handover notes from the day shift nurses, reviewed patient charts, and immediately began her rounds. According to her coworkers, Sarah was her usual cheerful self that night. A fellow nurse named Linda, who had been working with Sarah for over a year, later recalled that they had spent their brief break in the staff lounge talking about wedding cakes. Sarah had brought in a few fabric swatches for her bridesmaids' dresses to show Linda. There was no sign of stress. There was no unusual behavior. Sarah was focused, engaged, and looking forward to the future. The night dragged on, marked by the steady hum of medical monitors and the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum floors. In 1998, hospitals were still heavily reliant on paper records. Digital charts were in their infancy, so nurses spent a significant amount of their time updating thick, physical binders for each patient, writing down medication dosages, vitals, and observation notes by hand. Sarah was known for having impeccable handwriting and for being incredibly thorough with her documentation. Around 5 in the morning, the ward finally began to quiet down. The most critical patients were resting comfortably, and the nursing staff took a collective breath. Sarah sat at the central nurses' station, diligently updating her patient files. By 6:45, the morning shift nurses began to arrive. Sarah gave her handover report to the incoming staff, detailing which patients needed immediate attention and which ones had a rough night. At 7:15 on the morning of Friday, October 23, Sarah clocked out. Linda, who was walking toward the locker room with her, remembered Sarah throwing her heavy nursing bag over her shoulder and letting out an exhausted sigh. "I am going to sleep for 10 hours straight," Sarah had joked to Linda. "If Mark wakes me up before noon, he's planning this wedding by himself." Linda laughed, telling her to get some rest. They parted ways at the lobby elevators. Linda headed toward the cafeteria for breakfast, and Sarah walked out the sliding glass doors into the chilly, gray morning. The hospital employee parking garage was located just across a small side street, a massive concrete structure that always felt a little too dark, even in the daylight. That was the last time anyone ever saw Sarah Miller. When Mark woke up in their apartment at around 9 in the morning, he wasn't immediately concerned. The apartment was quiet, and Sarah's silver sedan wasn't in its usual spot in the lot out front. Mark assumed she had decided to run an errand after her shift. Sometimes she stopped at the grocery store to beat the morning rush, or went to the 24-hour pharmacy to pick up household supplies. He made himself a cup of coffee, turned on the morning news, and started getting ready for his own day. He had taken a rare Friday off from the construction site to help Sarah with some wedding tasks later that afternoon. But as the clock ticked past 10, and then 11, a small knot of unease began to form in Mark's stomach. Sarah was incredibly disciplined about her sleep schedule. Working the night shift meant that every hour of sleep was precious. She never stayed out this late after a shift. She would always come straight home, shower, and crawl into bed. By noon, Mark was actively packing the apartment. This wasn't like her, not even a little bit. In an era before cell phones were in every pocket, he had no way to instantly reach her. He picked up the landline in the kitchen and called Emily. "Is Sarah with you?" Mark asked as soon as Emily answered her dorm room phone. "No, I'm just leaving campus now," Emily replied, her voice bright and unbothered. "I'm meeting her at the bridal shop at 2. Why? Is she running late?" "She never came home from her shift," Mark said. The words felt heavy in his mouth. Saying them out loud made the situation feel incredibly real and incredibly wrong. Emily's tone instantly shifted. "What do you mean she never came home? Did you call the hospital?" Mark hadn't. He hung up with Emily and immediately dialed the main line for Lancaster General. He asked to be transferred to the 4th-floor nurses' station. A nurse he didn't recognize answered the phone. Mark explained who he was and asked if Sarah had picked up an extra shift or if she was still there helping out. The nurse checked the schedule and the punch logs. "No, sweetie," the nurse told him gently. "Sarah clocked out right on time at 7:15 this morning. She left hours ago." Panic, cold and sharp, washed over Mark. If she left the hospital at 7:15, where had she been for the last 5 hours? He grabbed his keys, ran down the stairs of his apartment building, and jumped into his truck. He drove the exact route Sarah would have taken from the hospital to their apartment, his eyes frantically scanning the sides of the road for her silver sedan. He thought maybe she had a flat tire or had pulled over feeling sick. But the streets were clear. When he reached the hospital, he didn't go inside. He drove straight into the employee parking garage. It was a massive, multi-level concrete maze. Employees parked on the upper levels to leave the ground floor open for patients and visitors. Mark drove up the ramps, his heart pounding in his chest, scanning rows and rows of vehicles. On the third floor, tucked into a corner spot near the stairwell, he saw it. Sarah's silver sedan. Mark slammed his truck into park and sprinted toward her car. "Sarah," he yelled, his voice echoing off the concrete walls, but the car was empty. He pressed his face against the driver's side window, cupping his hands over his eyes to block the glare. What he saw inside made his blood run cold. Sarah's heavy nursing bag was sitting on the passenger seat. Her favorite wool coat was tossed carelessly in the back. Her purse, containing her wallet, her identification, and her checkbook, was tucked on the floorboard. She hadn't gone to the store. She hadn't gone anywhere. Mark pulled the handle of the driver's door. It clicked open. The car was unlocked, which was completely out of character for Sarah. She was meticulous about safety. She would never leave her car unlocked in a parking garage with all of her belongings inside. He leaned into the car. The keys were missing from the ignition. The air inside felt stale and cold. And then his eyes drifted down to the driver's side floor mat. Lying there on the dark carpet was a small, torn piece of thick yellow paper. It looked exactly like the heavy cardstock used for the carbon copy shift logs on the hospital floor. But it was shredded, ripped violently in half. And just above it, on the bottom edge of the plastic steering wheel, was a single, dark red smudge. It was a drop of dried blood. Mark backed away from the car, his hands trembling. The hospital lobby was less than a 3-minute walk from where this car was parked. Sarah had walked out of those sliding glass doors at 7:15 in the morning, into a parking garage filled with people coming and going for the morning shift. How does a young woman simply vanish in a 3-minute walk, leaving everything she owns behind? What had happened in the shadows of this concrete garage? And more importantly, whose blood was on the steering wheel? Mark could barely breathe as he backed away from the silver sedan. His chest was heaving, and the cold air of the concrete parking garage suddenly felt suffocating. He didn't touch the car again. His hands were shaking so violently he had to shove them into his jacket pockets. He knew he couldn't tamper with a crime scene, but the realization that his fiancé's car was now a crime scene felt like a physical blow to his stomach. He turned and sprinted back down the ramp, his boots slapping heavily against the concrete. He burst through the ground-level doors and ran straight to the hospital security desk in the main lobby. The guard on duty took one look at Mark's pale, panicked face and immediately picked up the phone to call the Lancaster police. Within minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers reflected off the dull gray walls of the parking structure. Uniformed officers quickly taped off the third floor, stretching bright yellow caution tape from concrete pillar to concrete pillar. The quiet, ordinary Friday morning had instantly transformed into a chaotic nightmare. Detective Richard Harrison was the lead investigator assigned to the case. He was a veteran of the Lancaster police force, a quiet, methodical man who had worked missing person cases before, but rarely one that started with this much immediate dread. When Harrison arrived at the garage, he found Mark sitting on the cold curb just outside the police perimeter. Mark had his head buried in his hands, rocking slightly back and forth. Harrison knelt beside him, speaking in a calm, steady voice, trying to piece together the timeline. Mark explained that Sarah was supposed to be home hours ago, that she was a pediatric nurse who never broke her routine, and that he had found the car unlocked with all of her belongings sitting on the passenger seat. He told the detective about the torn yellow paper and the tiny drop of blood on the steering wheel. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Sarah's younger sister, Emily, pulled into the hospital lot. She had been waiting at the bridal boutique, completely unaware of the unfolding horror. When Mark had failed to show up, she had driven to the hospital, assuming there had been some sort of scheduling mix-up. Instead, she found a fleet of police cars and her future brother-in-law talking to a detective. When Emily saw the yellow police tape wrapping around the entrance to the third floor, her legs simply gave out. She collapsed onto the pavement, dropping her purse, a terrible, gut-wrenching sob tearing from her throat. Mark rushed over and caught her, holding her tightly as they both cried in the middle of the parking lot. It was a sound that Detective Harrison would never forget. It was the sound of a family realizing that the person they loved most in the world was gone. The forensic team went to work on the silver sedan. They carefully photographed the vehicle from every angle, dusted the door handles for fingerprints, and carefully collected the torn yellow paper using tweezers. They swabbed the tiny speck of blood on the steering wheel. In 1998, DNA testing was not the rapid, advanced science it is today. A sample that small was difficult to test without consuming the entire thing, but they were able to quickly determine one terrifying fact. It was human blood, and it was fresh. As the forensics team processed the car, Detective Harrison walked into the hospital to retrace Sarah's final steps. He started in the lobby. He requested the security VHS tapes from the front desk. The footage was grainy and in black and white, but the timestamp was clear. At 7:15 and 30 seconds, the automatic sliding glass doors opened. Sarah Miller walked through them, her heavy bag over her shoulder. She looked tired but calm. She buttoned her coat against the autumn chill, stepped out onto the sidewalk, and walked out of the camera's frame toward the parking garage across the street. She was completely alone. Nobody was following her out of the lobby. Nobody was waiting for her on the sidewalk. Harrison then interviewed the hospital staff. He spoke with Linda, the nurse who had walked to the elevator with Sarah. Linda was completely devastated, sitting in the break room with a tissue pressed to her eyes. She confirmed what Mark had already said. Sarah was happy. She was excited about her wedding. She had zero enemies, no stalkers, and no reason to disappear. The doctors who had worked the pediatric shift that night echoed the same sentiment. Sarah was a professional, a kind-hearted woman who was entirely focused on her patients. The initial theory was a random abduction. The parking garage was known for being poorly lit in certain corners, and there were no security cameras installed above the ground floor. Anyone could have walked up the stairs, waited in the shadows near Sarah's car, and ambushed her when she went to unlock her door. But this theory had glaring problems. If it was a robbery, why was her purse sitting on the floorboard completely untouched? Her wallet still had $50 in cash inside, and her credit cards were neatly tucked into their slots. If it was a random attack, why were there no signs of a massive struggle? Aside from the single drop of blood and the missing car keys, the interior of the car was perfectly neat. There were no scuff marks on the doors, no broken glass, and no dirt or debris to suggest a violent fight. And how had the attacker managed to force her out of the garage in the middle of the morning without a single person hearing a scream or seeing a struggle? The hospital was busy at 7:30 in the morning. Doctors, nurses, and administrative staff were constantly driving up and down those ramps. By the time the sun set on Friday evening, the entire town of Lancaster knew that Sarah Miller was missing. The police organized massive search efforts over the weekend. Volunteers handed out thousands of flyers featuring Sarah's warm, smiling face. The local news stations interrupted their regular broadcasts to show her picture, urging anyone who had been near the hospital that morning to call the tip line. Search and rescue dogs were brought to the parking garage. The dogs picked up Sarah's scent near the driver's side door, but they lost it almost immediately at the nearby stairwell, suggesting that whatever happened, she had likely been taken away in another vehicle. The community came together in a massive display of support. People searched the nearby woods, the local parks, and the empty fields bordering the town. Mark barely slept. He joined every search party, walking through thick brush until his clothes were torn and his voice was completely gone from shouting her name. Emily and her mother set up a command center in their living room, answering phones, organizing volunteers, and refusing to give up hope. But as the days turned into weeks, the investigation hit a wall. The police cleared Mark early on. He had a rock-solid alibi, having been seen at his apartment building by his neighbors, and his deep, crushing grief was undeniable to anyone who spoke to him. They looked into former patients, disgruntled family members at the hospital, and local offenders in the area. Every lead turned into a dead end. No one had seen anything. The tip line went cold. By November, the leaves had fallen from the trees, and the crisp autumn air had turned into a bitter winter chill. The flyers taped to telephone poles began to fade in the rain. The only physical evidence the police had was the torn piece of yellow cardstock found on the floor mat. Detective Harrison kept the piece of yellow paper on his desk, stored inside a clear plastic evidence bag. It tormented him. It was a thick, heavy paper, roughly 3 inches wide. The edges were jagged, showing that it had been ripped violently in half. The bottom half contained nothing but a series of faint, stamped numbers and a blank line for a signature. There was no patient name, no doctor's notes, and no medical terminology. The top half, which would have held all the identifying information, was missing. For weeks, Harrison had assumed it was just a piece of trash that had tracked into the car on the bottom of someone's shoe, or a random slip of paper from the pediatric ward. But something about the violent way it was torn bothered him. It looked deliberate. If Sarah had been ambushed by a stranger, why would a piece of hospital paperwork be torn in half during the struggle? Late one rainy Tuesday night in December, more than 2 months after Sarah had vanished, Harrison sat alone in the precinct. The station was quiet, filled only with the hum of the old radiator. He had requested the Lancaster General Hospital Administrative Manual earlier that week, trying to understand their filing systems in desperate hope of tracing the numbers on the slip. He flipped to the section on internal patient transfers. Back in 1998, when a patient needed to be moved from one ward to another, the nursing staff had to fill out carbon copy transfer slips to update the physical binders. To avoid confusion, the hospital used a strict color coding system for these slips. Harrison dragged his finger down the page, reading the color codes. Pediatric ward transfers were blue. Emergency room transfers were green. Surgical ward transfers were pink. Maternity ward transfers were white. Harrison stopped. He looked at the manual, then looked at the clear plastic bag on his desk containing the thick yellow paper. He turned the page of the manual. He found the section for the yellow slips. Yellow cardstock was used exclusively for one single department in the entire hospital. It was a restricted, secure ward located in the sub-basement levels of the building. It was the long-term palliative care and coma ward, a place for patients who were completely unresponsive and receiving end-of-life care. Harrison felt a sudden chill crawl up his spine. Sarah Miller was a pediatric nurse. She worked on the 4th floor, entirely dedicated to children. She had absolutely no authorization to visit the sub-basement. She had no patients down there. She had no medical reason to ever handle a yellow transfer slip. And yet, a freshly torn yellow slip from the restricted basement ward had ended up on the floorboard of her car, on the exact morning she disappeared. Harrison stared at the torn paper. This was no longer just a case of a random abduction in a parking garage. The threat hadn't been waiting in the shadows of the concrete structure. The threat, and the reason for her disappearance, had followed her out from the inside of the hospital. Armed with the shocking realization that the torn yellow slip belonged to the restricted sub-basement ward, Detective Richard Harrison wasted no time. At 8 o'clock the next morning, he marched straight into the administrative offices of Lancaster General Hospital. He demanded to see the physical patient logs and transfer records for the palliative care and coma ward, specifically for the dates of October 22 and 23. The hospital administration's reaction was immediate and highly defensive. The director of hospital operations, a nervous, sweating man in a cheap suit, told Harrison that he couldn't just casually browse through highly restricted patient files without a warrant. Harrison, refusing to back down, threatened to bring a judge and a team of officers to tear the basement apart. Reluctantly, the director agreed to take him down to the medical archives room. But when they reached the sub-basement, Harrison's hopes were instantly shattered. The archive room, a small concrete space at the end of a long, dark hallway, was completely empty. The metal shelving units were bare. When Harrison demanded to know where the October binders were, the director offered a painfully convenient excuse. He claimed that over the weekend, just 2 days after Sarah disappeared, a freak plumbing accident had caused a massive water leak in the ceiling. According to the director, the water had poured directly onto the October logbooks, destroying them completely. He claimed the ruined, moldy papers had been thrown into the medical incinerator for health and safety reasons. Harrison was furious. He knew it was a lie. You simply do not throw away official, legal medical documents without a massive, documented paper trail, even if they are water-damaged. He demanded to see the maintenance reports for the burst pipe. He demanded to speak to the janitorial staff who cleaned up the water. But within hours, the hospital's legal team stepped in, forming an impenetrable wall of corporate silence. Without a warrant, and without solid proof that a crime had actually occurred inside the hospital, Harrison's hands were legally tied. The trail went ice cold. The only piece of the puzzle he had was a torn piece of paper and a lie he couldn't disprove. Time is a cruel and silent thief. As the weeks turned into months and the months turned into years, the frantic energy of the initial search faded. 1998 turned into 1999, and soon, the new millennium arrived. 25 years drifted by like a long, painful sigh. The town of Lancaster changed. New businesses opened, old ones closed, and the community slowly moved on. But for the people who loved Sarah Miller, time had simply stopped on that cold October morning. Mark, Sarah's fiancé, spent years trapped in a prison of unresolved grief. He eventually moved out of the apartment they had shared, unable to bear the ghost of her presence in every room. He grew older, his dark hair turning gray, the youthful spark in his eyes replaced by a quiet, permanent sadness. He eventually married a kind woman who understood his past, but he never took off the small silver chain he wore around his neck. Hanging from it was Sarah's engagement ring. Every year on the 23rd of October, Mark would drive to the hospital parking garage, park his truck on the 3rd floor, and just sit in the silence for hours. Sarah's sister, Emily, channeled her heartbreak into a fierce determination. She abandoned her plans for a business degree and enrolled in nursing school. She wanted to finish the life that had been stolen from her sister. By her early 40s, Emily was a highly respected pediatric nurse at a hospital in Ohio. But she never stopped looking for answers. She kept a massive box of case files in her closet, spending her evenings scouring internet forums and missing person databases, refusing to accept that Sarah had simply vanished into thin air. Detective Harrison eventually retired. He handed in his badge and his gun, trading the stress of the precinct for the quiet life of a pensioner, but he never let go of the Miller case. In his home office, pinned to a corkboard right above his desk, was a blown-up photocopy of the torn yellow slip. He looked at it every single day. It was a haunting reminder of his biggest failure, a puzzle with missing pieces that kept him awake at night. He always believed the answer was buried somewhere, inside the walls of Lancaster General Hospital. He was absolutely right. In the spring of 2023, the hospital announced a massive, multi-million-dollar renovation project. The aging sub-basement, which had sat mostly unused for the last decade, was scheduled to be completely gutted to make way for a state-of-the-art MRI facility and a new digital records center. Demolition crews moved in with sledgehammers and heavy machinery, tearing down walls that had stood undisturbed since the 1970s. On a Tuesday afternoon in early May, a construction foreman named David was working in the darkest corner of the old palliative care ward. His crew was tasked with tearing down a thick section of drywall at the end of a long, dead-end corridor. David swung his sledgehammer, smashing a large hole in the plaster. But instead of hitting pipes or standard wall insulation, his hammer struck something incredibly solid. It made a loud, metallic clang that echoed down the empty hallway. Curious, David used his hands to rip away the chunks of broken drywall. Behind the false wall, hidden in a dark, dusty cavity, was a heavy, gray steel filing cabinet. It had been intentionally bricked in. Someone had literally built a wall around it to ensure it would never be found. David used a pry bar to force the locked drawers open. He expected to find old blueprints or forgotten construction supplies. Instead, he found stacks of thick, heavy binders. The binders were coated in a thick layer of dust, but the labels on their spines were clearly readable. They were the patient logs and transfer records from October 1998. Remembering the famous local legend of the young nurse who vanished from the hospital garage, David immediately dropped his tools. He walked out of the sub-basement, pulled out his cell phone, and called the Lancaster police. The current lead investigator for cold cases was Detective Elena Rostova, a sharp, meticulous woman who had inherited Harrison's old files. When she got the call from the construction site, she immediately drove to the hospital and took custody of the hidden cabinet. Her next call was to retired Detective Harrison. When Harrison got the news, he nearly dropped the phone. He drove to the precinct as fast as the speed limits allowed, his old heart pounding heavily against his ribs. Detective Rostova had also contacted Emily, who caught the first available flight from Ohio and rushed straight to the police station. They gathered in the fluorescent-lit evidence room, standing around a large metal table. The gray filing cabinet sat in the center. Harrison reached for the drawer with shaking hands. He pulled out the heavy, yellow binder labeled Palliative Care Transfers, October 1998. He opened the cover. The pages inside were perfectly dry, crisp, and entirely intact. There was absolutely no water damage, no mold, no fatting. The 1998 flood in the archive room had been a complete, fabricated lie. Someone in hospital administration had deliberately hidden these records and built a literal wall to protect them. The room was dead silent as Harrison slowly turned the heavy pages, his finger tracing the dates at the top of each log. October 20, October 21, October 22. Then he flipped to the morning of Friday, October 23. His breath hitched in his throat. Halfway down the page, attached to the master logbook, was a carbon copy of a yellow transfer slip. It was the top half. The bottom half had been torn away. Harrison quickly pulled his wallet from his pocket. He always carried a laminated photograph of the torn slip he had found in Sarah's car. He placed the photo next to the logbook. The jagged, torn edges lined up perfectly. More importantly, the faint, stamped serial number on the bottom of his photo, number 4097, matched the serial number printed at the top of the page in the binder. This was it. After 25 years, they finally had the missing half of the puzzle. Emily grabbed the edge of the metal table to steady herself. "What does it say?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What is it?" Harrison leaned in, his eyes scanning the meticulous, handwritten details on the intact top half of the slip. It was an authorization form for a deceased patient transfer. This specific yellow slip was used to log when a patient passed away in the night and needed to be moved from the sub-basement to the hospital morgue, or transferred out to a funeral home. But as Harrison read the details written on the lines, a feeling of pure dread washed over him. The line for the patient's name was simply marked Jane Doe, but the patient's physical vitals were listed in detail. Age 24. Height 5'5". Weight 130 pounds. Blood type O negative. Emily let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. It was an exact, perfect match for Sarah. Her age, her height, her precise weight, even her rare blood type. Harrison's eyes darted to the timeline section of the slip. The transfer was logged and approved at exactly 7:30 in the morning. That was exactly 15 minutes after Sarah had vanished from the parking garage. Someone hadn't kidnapped Sarah and driven her away in another car. Someone had attacked her in the garage, stolen her keys to hide her belongings in her own vehicle, and then brought her right back inside the hospital. They had smuggled her down into the sub-basement, logged her as a deceased, unidentified patient, and used the hospital's own medical transport system to remove her body from the building under the guise of an official transfer. It was a perfectly executed, terrifyingly cold cover-up. But the most shocking detail was at the very bottom of the page. In order for a deceased patient to be transferred out of the sub-basement, a senior medical official had to sign the authorization line. Harrison stared at the signature written in bold, blue ink. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a random administrative clerk. The signature belonged to Dr. Thomas Weaver. Emily stared at the name, tears instantly welling in her eyes as a wave of nausea hit her. Dr. Thomas Weaver was the beloved head of the pediatric ward. He was the gentle, soft-spoken doctor who had been Sarah's personal mentor. He was the man who had stood at the front of the crowd during Sarah's candlelight vigil in 1998, holding a candle and weeping openly in front of the local news cameras, talking about how much he loved her like a daughter. And according to this hidden medical record, he was the exact man who signed the paperwork to dispose of her. The fluorescent lights in the evidence room seemed to hum louder as the reality of the signature settled over them. Emily stared at the name written in bold blue ink, her mind violently rejecting what her eyes were seeing. Dr. Thomas Weaver. It was a name that carried so much warmth, so much respect in their community. He was the man who had written glowing letters of recommendation for Sarah. He was the man who had stood in Emily's living room, holding her weeping mother's hands, promising that the hospital would never stop looking for her. He had even spoken at the candlelight vigil, his voice breaking with emotion as he called Sarah the brightest light on his staff. A wave of intense nausea hit Emily, forcing her to grip the edge of the metal table just to stay on her feet. The betrayal was so deep, so absolute, that it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. He had hugged her family. He had watched them cry. He had watched Mark tear his own life apart searching the woods in the freezing rain, knowing the entire time exactly what had happened. Detective Harrison was vibrating with a quiet, terrifying anger. For 25 years, he had blamed himself for missing a clue. He had stayed awake countless nights wondering what kind of monster had been lurking in the shadows of that concrete parking garage. But the monster hadn't been a stranger hiding in the dark. The monster had been wearing a white coat, sitting right next to him at the hospital press conferences. Detective Elena Rostova, keeping her emotions strictly in check, leaned over the binder. Her eyes scanned the rest of the yellow transfer slip, looking for the next critical piece of information. If Dr. Weaver had signed Sarah out as a deceased Jane Doe, the hospital protocol required the body to be sent somewhere. You could not simply wheel a body out the front doors without an authorized destination. Her finger traced down to the bottom left corner of the page, stopping at a small, stamped box labeled Destination Facility. Written in the same blue ink in Dr. Weaver's handwriting was the name, Valley View Crematory. Harrison immediately recognized the name. Valley View was a small, private cremation facility on the rural outskirts of Lancaster County. It had been shut down and demolished back in 2002 after the owner retired. Rostova didn't waste a second. She ran to the evidence room computer and pulled up the old business license records for Lancaster County. She typed in Valley View Crematory. The screen populated with the business details from 1998. The registered owner and operator was a man named Arthur Pendleton. Rostova cross-referenced Arthur Pendleton's background. She pulled up his family records, scanning his listed relatives. Her eyes widened as she read the screen. Arthur Pendleton had a younger sister named Margaret, and Margaret Pendleton was legally married to Dr. Thomas Weaver. The room went dead silent. The connection was flawless. It was horrifyingly perfect. Weaver hadn't just murdered Sarah. He had used his own brother-in-law's private facility to completely destroy the evidence, ensuring that her body would never be found by the search dogs, the police, or her desperate family. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Harrison and Rostova were driving out to a quiet, assisted living facility in the neighboring county. Public records showed that Arthur Pendleton, now 82 years old and in declining health, was a permanent resident there. They found Arthur sitting in a wheelchair near a large window in the recreation room, staring blankly at the television. He looked frail, his hands shaking slightly as they rested on his lap. Harrison pulled up a chair directly in front of him, leaning in close so he wouldn't be overheard by the nursing staff. Rostova placed a large, clear photograph of Sarah Miller on the small table next to Arthur. She didn't ask a question. She just let the smiling face of the 24-year-old nurse sit there in the silence. Arthur looked down at the photograph. The reaction was immediate. All the color drained from his wrinkled face. His breathing hitched and his trembling hands suddenly gripped the armrests of his wheelchair. Tears instantly welled up in his faded eyes, spilling over his cheeks. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't act confused. He just started to quietly, desperately sob. "I didn't know who she was," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of a 25-year-old secret. "I swear to God, I didn't know until I saw the news days later." Harrison leaned in closer, his voice cold and firm. "Tell us exactly what happened that Friday morning, Arthur." Arthur took a shaky breath, finally unburdening his soul. He explained that early on the morning of October 23, 1998, Dr. Weaver had called him in a total panic. Weaver claimed there was an emergency at the hospital. An unidentified, homeless woman had passed away in the palliative care ward. Weaver told Arthur that the county needed the body cremated immediately due to a severe infectious disease risk, and he was bringing her over personally in a hospital transport van. Arthur had trusted his brother-in-law. When Weaver arrived at the rural crematory just before 8 in the morning, he unloaded a heavy black hospital body bag. But Weaver didn't just drop it off. He demanded that Arthur fire up the incinerator right then and there. Arthur remembered how nervous Weaver looked. His hospital scrubs were wrinkled, and he had a deep, fresh scratch on the side of his neck. Weaver stood directly in front of the massive furnace, refusing to leave. He watched the fire burn for 3 straight hours, staring into the flames until there was absolutely nothing left but ash. Weaver then swept the ashes into a plastic industrial bag, took them to his car, and drove away. When Sarah's face was plastered all over the evening news that weekend, Arthur realized the horrifying truth of what he had helped destroy. He confronted Weaver, threatening to go to the police. But Weaver had calmly reminded him that by incinerating the body without proper county death certificates, Arthur was legally an accomplice to murder. Weaver threatened to destroy Arthur's life, his business, and his family if he ever breathed a word of it to anyone. Terrified, Arthur had kept his mouth shut, living with the unbearable guilt every single day since. They had the disposal, they had the cover-up, but they still needed the motive. Why would the beloved head of pediatrics murder a young, innocent nurse in cold blood? Harrison and Rostova rushed back to the precinct, where Emily was waiting. Emily had spent the last 2 hours doing her own investigation. As a veteran pediatric nurse herself, she had asked the police department's IT technician to access the hospital's digitized historical archives. If the sub-basement records had survived, she wanted to see if the main pediatric server from 1998 had been backed up. It had been. Emily sat at a computer terminal, staring intensely at a spreadsheet of data. She was looking at the pediatric ward's activity logs from Sarah's final shift. She knew her sister better than anyone. Sarah was incredibly meticulous. She always did her chart audits at the end of her night shifts, double-checking medication dosages to make sure the morning shift nurses had a perfectly clean slate. "Look at this," Emily said, her voice shaking with adrenaline as Harrison and Rostova walked up behind her. She pointed to a column on the screen. "This is the pharmacy dispensation log for October 1998. Emily explained that back then, high-level liquid painkillers like fentanyl and morphine were kept in a locked cabinet. Only senior doctors had the master key, but the nurses had to physically log every drop that was administered to a patient. Emily had cross-referenced the pharmacy key logs with the patient charts. She found a massive, glaring discrepancy. Over the course of 6 months in 1998, massive amounts of liquid fentanyl were being signed out of the pharmacy cabinet. The physical key log showed that Dr. Weaver was the one unlocking the cabinet in the middle of the night, but he was logging the medication under the names of pediatric patients who had already been discharged, or tragically, patients who had already passed away. Dr. Thomas Weaver, the respected pillar of the community, was stealing massive quantities of highly addictive narcotics. He was either feeding a severe personal addiction, or he was selling it. "Sarah found out," Emily whispered, tears blurring her vision as the final pieces clicked into place. During her final shift, she was auditing the charts. She must have matched the pharmacy logs to the discharged patients. She printed out the proof. Harrison felt a cold chill run through his veins. Sarah wasn't abducted randomly. She had confronted him. She likely gathered the physical printouts, put them in her nursing bag, and intended to report him to the hospital board or the police that very morning. Weaver must have realized what she was doing. He followed her out to her car, desperate to protect his career, his wealth, and his freedom. He attacked her in the garage to get those papers back. But they needed physical proof. The forged medical records and Arthur's testimony were incredibly strong, but a smart defense attorney could argue that Arthur was lying to protect himself, and that Weaver's signature had been forged. They needed the final, undeniable piece of evidence connecting Weaver directly to the violence in the parking garage. Rostova immediately drafted a search warrant for Dr. Thomas Weaver's current residence. A judge signed it within 20 minutes. Weaver lived in an exclusive, heavily gated community in the wealthy suburbs of Lancaster. His sprawling estate sat at the end of a long, manicured driveway, surrounded by tall oak trees and expensive landscaping. It was a life built on a foundation of lies and blood. At 5 o'clock in the evening, a convoy of unmarked police vehicles pulled up to the iron gates. Harrison rode in the passenger seat of Rostova's car, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth hurt. He thought about Mark, sitting in a cold apartment for years, unable to move on. He thought about Emily, dedicating her entire life to a profession just to feel close to the sister that this man had stolen. The tactical team breached the front door of the mansion. The massive house was quiet, filled with expensive artwork and antique furniture. Dr. Thomas Weaver, now in his late 70s, was sitting in a leather chair in his massive home library, drinking a glass of scotch. He looked up, entirely unbothered as heavily armed officers flooded into his home. His arrogant, calm demeanor made Harrison sick to his stomach. Weaver demanded to know the meaning of this intrusion, threatening to call his lawyers and have every officer's badge. Rostova stepped forward, holding the search warrant. She didn't blink. She simply told him he was under investigation for the 1998 murder of Sarah Miller. For a split second, a flicker of genuine panic crossed Weaver's eyes, but he quickly masked it behind a wall of arrogant indignation. He told them they were insane, that Sarah was a tragedy, and that they would find absolutely nothing in his house. The forensic team began tearing the mansion apart. They searched the bedrooms, the basement, the garage, and the home office. Hours passed. The sun set outside, casting long, dark shadows across the library walls. Weaver sat in his chair, a smug, confident smile slowly creeping back onto his face. He truly believed he had gotten away with it. He believed that because the body was ashes, he was untouchable. But Detective Harrison wasn't looking for a body. He was looking for the ego of an arrogant man. He knew that killers like Weaver, men who believed they were smarter than everyone else, always kept a trophy. They always kept a safety net. Harrison stood in the center of the library, looking at the massive oak bookshelves that lined the walls. Something about the layout of the room felt slightly off. He walked over to a heavy, built-in wooden cabinet near the fireplace. He ran his hands along the wood paneling, pressing against the corners. There was a faint click. A hidden compartment in the side of the cabinet popped open. Inside the dark recess was a heavy, steel wall safe. Weaver's face instantly went pale. The smug smile vanished, replaced by sheer, undeniable terror. Rostova ordered Weaver to open the safe. When he refused, his hands shaking violently, the police brought in a mechanical breaching tool to force the steel door open. The loud grinding of metal echoed through the quiet library, sounding like a death knell for the corrupt doctor. With a loud crack, the safe door swung open. Harrison put on a pair of latex gloves. He reached into the dark interior of the safe. There were stacks of cash, old passports, and legal documents. But at the very bottom, hidden beneath everything else, was a thick, sealed manila envelope. Harrison carefully pulled the envelope out and placed it on the large mahogany desk in the center of the room. Rostova stood next to him, her flashlight illuminating the desk. Weaver was now hyperventilating, struggling against the officers holding him in his chair. Harrison broke the seal on the envelope. He tipped it upside down. A set of keys clattered onto the wooden desk. Attached to the keys was a faded, plastic keychain shaped like a pediatric stethoscope. They were the car keys that had been missing from Sarah's silver sedan for 25 years. But that wasn't all. Harrison reached back into the envelope and pulled out a stack of folded, yellowed hospital computer paper. It was the 1998 pharmacy audit logs. The pages were covered in Sarah's meticulous handwriting, circling Weaver's fraudulent narcotic withdrawals. And on the very top page, right next to Sarah's signature, was a large, dark, rusted stain. It was a massive smear of dried blood. The sight of the dried blood on those old, yellowed hospital papers seemed to pull all the oxygen out of the massive library. Detective Harrison stared at the dark, rusted stain, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. It was the undeniable, physical proof they had been searching for over the last 2.5 decades. The blood on those audit logs matched the single drop found on the steering wheel of the silver sedan. Dr. Thomas Weaver, the man who had spent 25 years pretending to be a grieving mentor, completely collapsed in his leather chair. The arrogant posture he had maintained for decades instantly vanished. He looked small, pathetic, and suddenly very old. His hands shook so violently that he dropped his crystal glass of scotch. It shattered on the expensive hardwood floor, the amber liquid pooling around his expensive leather shoes. Detective Elena Rostova did not hesitate. She stepped around the mahogany desk, pulled her handcuffs from her belt, and grabbed Weaver by the arms. She hauled him out of his chair and slammed him against the heavy oak bookshelves. The sound of the metal cuffs clicking into place echoed loudly through the silent mansion. As she read him his Miranda rights, Weaver didn't fight back. He didn't yell. He just stared blankly at the floor, breathing in rapid, shallow gasps. The impenetrable wall he had built around his terrible secret had just come crashing down. That night in the cold, windowless interrogation room at the Lancaster police precinct, Weaver finally broke. Sitting across a metal table from Harrison and Rostova, wearing an Orange County Jail uniform that stripped away all of his manufactured dignity, he confessed to everything. He spoke in a quiet, defeated whisper, staring down at his handcuffed wrists. He confirmed what Emily had suspected. In the late 90s, Weaver had developed a severe addiction to the liquid fentanyl he was stealing from the pediatric pharmacy. He had covered his tracks by forging the signatures of nurses and logging the drugs under the names of patients who were no longer on the floor. He thought he was a genius. He thought he was untouchable. But he had underestimated Sarah Miller. Weaver explained that on the morning of October 23, 1998, Sarah had stayed late to audit the pharmacy charts. She was meticulous, and she caught the discrepancies. She realized that massive amounts of narcotics were vanishing, and that Weaver's master key was the only one being used at those times. She printed out the raw data from the computer system, proving his guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt. Weaver told the detectives that he had noticed her sitting at the nurse's station, holding the printed logs. He saw the look of horrified realization on her face. When she packed the papers into her bag and walked out of the hospital, he panicked. He knew that if she took those papers to the police or the medical board, his entire life, his wealth, his medical license, and his freedom would be destroyed instantly. He followed her out of the sliding glass doors, keeping a safe distance until she entered the concrete parking garage. He walked up to her car just as she sat down in the driver's seat. "I just wanted the papers," Weaver whispered, tears of self-pity finally rolling down his wrinkled cheeks. "I tapped on her window. She rolled it down. I begged her to give them to me. I told her I would get help. I told her I would go to rehab." But Sarah was not intimidated by his authority. She was a fierce protector of her patients. She looked him right in the eye and told him that he was stealing medicine from sick children and that she was driving straight to the police station. When she turned the key in the ignition, Weaver snapped. He reached through the open window, grabbed her by the hair, and violently slammed her head against the steering wheel. That single, brutal strike was what caused the drop of blood to fall onto the plastic column. Sarah fought back fiercely. She clawed at his arms and his chest. During the struggle, Weaver reached into his pocket to grab his hospital security badge to open the heavy fire doors in the stairwell. When he pulled his hand out, a blank yellow transfer slip he had been carrying for his morning rounds fell out. In the chaos of the fight, Sarah grabbed it, tearing it in half as she desperately tried to push him away. The bottom half fell onto her floor mat, leaving the only clue they would ever find. Weaver overpowered her. He unlocked the doors, shoved her unconscious body into the spacious trunk of his own luxury sedan parked nearby, and took her keys. He left her purse and her belongings on the passenger seat to make it look like a random abduction. He drove around to the private, secure loading dock at the back of the hospital. Using his senior medical clearance, he bypassed the security desk and carried her directly into the restricted sub-basement. He placed her on a gurney, filled out the top half of the torn yellow slip logging her as a deceased Jane Doe, and loaded her into a hospital transport van. By 8 o'clock that morning, he was standing in front of the incinerator at Valley View Crematory, watching his brother-in-law burn the evidence of his terrible crime. "Why did you keep the keys?" Harrison asked, his voice thick with disgust. "Why did you keep the bloody papers?" Weaver looked up, his eyes hollow. "I thought if I burned the keys, the metal would survive the fire. Arthur would see them in the ashes and know she wasn't a homeless woman. And the papers, I just couldn't bring myself to destroy them. They were the only proof of what I had done. Keeping them locked away made me feel like I was in control of the secret." Harrison stood up from the table, entirely repulsed by the man sitting in front of him. Weaver wasn't sorry that he had stolen a beautiful, vibrant life. He was only sorry that he had finally been caught. The hardest part of the investigation came the next morning. Harrison and Rostova drove to the quiet suburban neighborhood where Mark now lived. Emily had flown in from Ohio and was waiting at Mark's house. When the two detectives walked up the front steps, holding a large, brown evidence box, Mark and Emily were standing on the porch. Harrison didn't say a word at first. He just unzipped the evidence bag and pulled out the small, plastic pediatric stethoscope keychain attached to a set of silver car keys. Mark stared at the keys. For 25 years, he had held onto a desperate, agonizing sliver of hope that maybe Sarah had run away, or that maybe she had suffered from amnesia and was living a happy life somewhere else. But seeing her keys, the ones she had held in her hands that very morning, shattered that final illusion. Mark fell to his knees right there on the wooden porch. A raw, guttural sob tore from his chest. It was the sound of a heart finally breaking all the way through, the sound of a quarter-century of waiting coming to a devastating end. Emily dropped to the floor beside him, throwing her arms around his shoulders, burying her face in his jacket as she wept uncontrollably. Harrison knelt down next to them, placing a gentle hand on Mark's shoulder. With a soft, steady voice, he told them the entire truth. He told them about the hidden filing cabinet. He told them about the stolen medication. And most importantly, he told them that Sarah had died a hero. She hadn't been a random victim. She had stood up to a powerful, corrupt man to protect the children she cared for. She was incredibly brave, right up until her very last breath. Hearing that truth brought a strange, heavy sense of peace to the crushing grief. Sarah hadn't abandoned them. She had been taken from them because she was doing the right thing. The trial of Dr. Thomas Weaver was the biggest news story in the history of Lancaster County. The community was absolutely horrified to learn that the respected pediatrician they had trusted with their children was a monster. Weaver's expensive defense attorneys tried to argue that the confession was coerced, but the physical evidence was utterly overwhelming. The blood on the papers matched Sarah's DNA. Arthur Pendleton took the stand and tearfully testified against his brother-in-law in exchange for a lighter sentence. It took the jury less than 2 hours to reach a verdict. Dr. Thomas Weaver was found guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and massive medical fraud. The judge, looking down at Weaver with absolute contempt, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Weaver was stripped of his medical license, his wealth was seized to pay restitution, and his legacy was permanently destroyed. He would die in a maximum security prison just 3 years later, completely alone and forgotten by the world. In the aftermath of the trial, the healing process finally began for the people who had loved Sarah most. Because there was no body to recover, Emily and Mark organized a beautiful memorial service at the local botanical gardens, a place Sarah used to visit every spring. Hundreds of people from the community attended. The nurses who used to work the night shift with her brought flowers. Former patients, now fully grown adults, came to pay their respects to the kind woman who had read them stories in the dark. During the ceremony, Mark walked up to the front of the gathering. He stood by a large, smiling photograph of Sarah from their engagement shoot. He reached up and unclasped the silver chain from around his neck. He took her engagement ring, kissed it gently, and placed it inside a small, wooden memory box filled with her favorite things. For the first time in 25 years, Mark felt like he had permission to breathe. He had fought for her. He had never given up. And now he could finally let her rest. Emily returned to Ohio with a renewed sense of purpose. She worked with her hospital board to implement incredibly strict, digitized security measures for pharmacy logs, ensuring that no doctor could ever abuse their power the way Weaver had. She dedicated the rest of her career to patient safety, keeping her sister's protective spirit alive in everything she did. Detective Harrison completely retired, this time for good. He finally took the blown-up photocopy of the torn yellow slip off the corkboard in his home office. He folded it neatly, placed it in a drawer, and went outside to sit on his porch, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. The puzzle was finally solved. The tragic story of Sarah Miller is a heartbreaking reminder that the darkest secrets can be hidden in the brightest places. For 25 years, a murderer hid behind a white coat, a respected title, and a fake smile. He built literal walls to protect his lies, believing that time and silence would erase his sins. But time is also the ultimate revealer of truth. It proves that no matter how deep you bury a secret, no matter how many walls you build around it, the truth is always waiting to be found. It just takes one crack in the foundation, one swing of a hammer, one hidden clue to bring the darkness out into the light. Justice may be delayed, and the waiting may break our hearts, but in the end, the truth always speaks for those who can no longer speak for themselves.